everybody. Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining me for another true crime deep dive. And today we're heading back to Arkansas to finish our series about the Boys on the Tracks case, an enduring mystery that has lingered for decades with no official closure or justice. Initially ruled an accident, the deaths of teenagers Kevin Ives and Henry were said to be caused by a tragic mishap involving the boys falling asleep on the tracks, but their families knew better. And as new evidence surfaced, the story spiraled into a web of corruption, drug smuggling, and cover-ups that reached deep into the heart of Arkansas politics. From rumors of a clandestine drug trade operating under the radar to allegations of law enforcement complicity, this case shook the state and left a trail of questions that remain unanswered to this day. And as we have come to find over the last 3 videos, this is more than a small-town mystery. It is a case that reaches into the darkest corners of power, exposing how far people will go to protect secrets and how low they will sink to protect themselves. Before we dive into today's video, let's have a word from the sponsor of today's video, Surfshark VPN. Here we are in the new year of 2025, and the need for a VPN is greater than ever before. As you probably know, the insanely popular app TikTok is set to be banned in the United States this month, and the news has caused quite a stir. So after this ban, new users will be unable to download the app, but even if you still have it on your phone, you won't be able to update the software, which will make the app slow and buggy over time. But Surfshark VPN doesn't play that censorship game, and they have over 3,200 servers in 100 countries, so technically, all you have to do once this ban goes through is switch your location to a country where TikTok is not banned and continue scrolling in happiness. With Surfshark VPN, you can also unlock 15 of the largest Netflix country libraries, including the US and Japan. All you have to do is connect to a server in that country, easy as can be, and you can also access BBC iPlayer, Hulu, and other limited streaming services wherever you are by using VPN servers in the countries where these things are available. And there are Surfshark VPN apps for all platforms, from PC to Mac to Linux, Android, iOS, smart TVs, Amazon Fire Stick TV, Apple TV, Chrome, Firefox, Xbox, and PlayStation. It's crazy. You can literally put Surfshark on everything. I like putting Surfshark on our gaming systems at home, the PlayStation, my son's computer, because he does a lot of gaming there, because he's, a young kid, and I don't want any of the grown adults that he's playing with to be able to figure out where he's connecting from, to be able to track his IP. That's why Surfshark VPN is perfect when it comes to gaming, any kind of scrolling online, any kind of, searching online, any kind of social media stuff where somebody might be able to figure out where you're connecting from. Surfshark makes it so that they can't. Surfshark isn't just about entertainment. It's keeping you safe online by securing your data with industry-leading measures using uncrackable encryption and the most secure VPN protocols. They also provide IP and DNS leak protection, so like I said, nobody can see where you're connecting from. And Surfshark maintains a strict no-logs policy. That means they're not going to save or store your data. What you're doing on the internet is your business. Best of all, one Surfshark VPN subscription allows you to install and run Surfshark on an unlimited number of devices at the same time. And I mean unlimited, so you can have it on your computer, your mom's computer, your kids' computers, your tablets, your dad's tablet, your sister and brother's tablets, your kids' tablets, your phones, your entire family's phones, everything unlimited completely. And with a 30-day money-back guarantee, you're going to have plenty of time to check out all that Surfshark VPN has to offer and make sure it meets your needs and is right for you. And right now, if you go to surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe, you will get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN, and you can start surfing and streaming with the sense of safety and peace that you deserve. Once again, that is surfshark.com/stephanieharlowe, or click the link in the description box to protect your online privacy today. I'm going to open up today's video by telling you about Barry Seal and the Mena airport scandal. Together, they represent one of the most controversial and complex intersections of drug trafficking, covert government operations, and conspiracy theories in modern American history. Barry Seal's story involves the CIA, the Medellin cartel, and clandestine operations during the Reagan administration, and it's blending verified events with speculative and sometimes sensationalized claims. But even without the more sensational aspects that may or may not be true, this story is stranger than fiction, and that's why they made it into a movie. I forget what the movie's called. Oh, it's called American Made, and it stars Tom Cruise, and he plays Barry Seal. So if you're interested in learning more about what we're going to talk about here, because unfortunately, you could make an entire series about Barry Seal, so we have to give a very condensed version here. I know it's tough for you to do that. It's very tough for me to do that. I hate to do it to you, but if you want to know more about Barry Seal, there's tons of information out there. You can watch the movie. Obviously, in the movie, certain things have been exaggerated for entertainment, but it's a good movie. So Barry Seal was born Adler Berryman Seal in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His mother was a homemaker, and his father was a candy wholesaler who was also reportedly and allegedly a member of the KKK, although this fact is still up for debate. From a young age, Seal was interested in planes and flying, and he earned his pilot's certificate at the age of 16 and his private pilot's license when he was 17. Now, Barry's flight instructor described him as being a naturally gifted pilot and had reportedly let Barry fly solo after only 8 hours of training. But young Barry Seal, he was known to be reckless, and he was known to take risks. And his flight instructor recognized early on that Seal did not seem to be able to grasp that his actions had consequences, and this is going to remain true for the rest of Seal's life. In 1962, Seal enlisted in the Louisiana National Guard for 6 years, and he was assigned to the 20th Special Forces Group, graduating from the U.S. Army Airborne School, where he was known for being able to push an aircraft past its limits, executing death-defying stunts without even breaking a sweat. He also gained a reputation for being able to fly in almost any weather condition. And after this, Seal joined TWA, was an airline. He joined as a flight engineer, and he was soon promoted to first officer, then a captain, and he became one of the youngest pilots in the TWA fleet. Barry Seal's association with the CIA is a topic of considerable speculation, even though he had openly bragged about working for the agency himself more than once. And while there's no definitive documentation proving that he officially joined the CIA as a formal agent, which, I mean, there wouldn't be, it's the CIA, there is evidence suggesting that he worked as an asset or an informant for various U.S. government agencies, including the DEA, and possibly he collaborated with the CIA during his future smuggling and informant activities. Now, some reports claim that Seal's connection to the CIA began in the late 50s or 60s when he was a young pilot in the Civil Air Patrol in Baton Rouge, and there's a huge conspiracy theory surrounding the Civil Air Patrol that I had never heard of before. Now I need to know everything about it. I love doing these videos specifically for this reason, because I learn things. I would have never encountered this sort of conspiracy theory, and it goes really deep, but I have to give you the Cliff Notes version in the interest of time. So the Civil Air Patrol, or CAP, was a civilian auxiliary of the United States Air Force, and it was primarily designed for aviation training and community service. However, conspiracy theorists argue that CAP, the Civil Air Patrol, acted as a breeding ground for young recruits who were later funneled into covert government operations or intelligence agencies like the CIA. Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin of JFK, he joined CAP as a teenager in New Orleans in the mid-1950s, and while a member, Oswald reportedly trained under somebody named David Ferry, a pilot and CAP leader who later became embroiled in the JFK assassination conspiracy theories. Now, David Ferry, with his ties to anti-Castro operations and alleged connections to the CIA, he's become a central figure in theories linking Oswald to intelligence operations, and this has led some to speculate that Oswald's time in the CAP was part of his grooming for later roles, whether as a covert operative or a patsy in the assassination, depending on what you believe about JFK. and how he eventually met his end. Barry Seal was also a member of CAP in his teenage years, and both Seal and Oswald were involved in CAP squadrons in Louisiana. This proximity, along with the presence of controversial figures like David Ferrie, has led to speculation about a broader network operating in that region during the Cold War. So there are theories that at this time, the 1950s, Seal was recruited by the CIA through CAP. However, his activities in the 1980s have drawn the most attention regarding a possible CIA connection. As a drug smuggler for the Medellin cartel, Seal transported vast quantities of cocaine into the United States, and at the height of his career, he was reportedly earning up to $1 million per flight. When he was arrested in 1984, he started cooperating with the DEA as an informant, providing intelligence on cartel operations, which, as you're probably aware, didn't put him in good standing with the very same people he had worked with, which would be the cartels and drug traffickers and things like that. And within 2 years, Barry Seal would be dead, taken out by hitmen hired by the Medellin cartel. But before this, Barry Seal was allegedly using the Mina Intermountain Municipal Airport in Arkansas to carry out his drug smuggling activities in the mid-1980s. Seal reportedly began using the Mina airport during this period due to its secluded location, low-profile operations, and the infrastructure needed to accommodate his modified planes. They had hangars and equipment there that were perfect for what he needed for these planes that he had specifically sort of calibrated to be drug smuggling planes, like hidden compartments and extra storage for fuel so that he could fly longer and not have to land and refuel and things like that. So not only was the Mina airport the perfect place for Barry Seal to kind of land once he got into the United States, but there has been alleged local cooperation in the area, meaning accusations were leveled that local and federal authorities turned a blind eye to Seal's activities in order to facilitate larger covert operations. So what were these larger covert operations, you might ask? Allegedly, Seal's activities were part of a broader network of drug and arms trafficking tied to the Iran-Contra scandal. We've already talked about this scandal earlier in the series, and this scandal happened because the United States illegally sold arms to Iran and then used the profits to support the Contras, right? It was a big thing back in the day. A lot of high-ranking public officials were implicated. A lot of stuff was going down. It was, government, state, local level, everything. So not only was Barry Seal flying cocaine into the U.S., but allegedly also weapons. And on top of that, it has been suggested that portions of the proceeds of drug sales in the U.S. from Barry Seal and probably others were used to finance the CIA program to arm the Contras in Nicaragua during the 80s. So what makes this all even more suspicious is that there were investigations into the Mena airport scandal done by both Arkansas State Police and the federal government, and the results of these investigations were all inconclusive, which many claim is even further evidence of a cover-up and a conspiracy. And we see this with the Boys on the Tracks case, right? We see all of these hearings and, investigations and, we're gonna do a deep dive into what happened here, and they all come back inconclusive. Nothing ever goes anywhere. Nothing ever leads to any answers. So it does seem a little bit like, any sort of law enforcement agency looking into what was going on at the Mena airport, looking into Barry Seal's activities, they were probably going to find something, but the fact that it's come back inconclusive, it doesn't mean they didn't find anything. It just means that, honestly, they didn't want to do anything with what they found, in my opinion. So let's return to Jean Duffy, who we were introduced to in part 3 of this series. Duffy was a prosecutor in Saline County when she was appointed the head of a drug task force in 1990. Duffy and her work with that task force have become a focal point in the larger narrative surrounding allegations of corruption, drug trafficking, and cover-ups in the state at that time. Now, Jean Duffy claims that from the very start, she encountered significant obstacles in her task, which was to investigate and prosecute drug-related crimes in that area of Arkansas. And remember that by the time Duffy's task force was created, a federal investigation into public official corruption was already happening with Assistant U.S. Attorney Bob Govar at the helm. And the month before Duffy's task force was organized, she was shown Govar's first memo to his boss, Chuck Banks, which we went over already in the last video. This memo implicated attorney Dan Harmon, and this gave Duffy an idea of where to focus her investigations. She hired 6 investigators to help her, and they immediately began uncovering information and evidence. Jean Duffy said, quote, "It didn't take but a few weeks before my undercover officers began coming back with information on public officials. They began developing their confidential informants, and in almost no time, they started getting this information relating to Harmon, who by then had won the Democratic primary for district prosecuting attorney, and other public officials. It all happened very quickly. It was amazing. We ran across situations where certain case files didn't reconcile with arrest records. There were instances where weapons, vehicles, drugs, and money had been confiscated, but didn't line up with the final court orders on the disposition of these items," end quote. Okay, so what she means by that is there was arrests where weapons, money, drugs would be taken into custody by the police, and then the amount that they would recover from the arrests would not be the same amount that would be placed into evidence. So whether, there was a gun or a few guns missing, whether there was some, a couple grams of cocaine missing, whether there was a couple $1,000s missing, they weren't adding up. The things that were coming out of these arrests and out of these investigations were not all making it into evidence, which I think I did say last episode. That's very common, I think, in law enforcement. I think a lot of this skimming off the top happens. But was there more nefarious reasons here? Was that money and was that drugs and were those weapons being used for some broader or grander kind of drug activities or illegal activities going on in this area of Arkansas at that time? So Jean Duffy began sending all the information that she was getting from her investigators and their informants to Bob Govar. But suddenly, Duffy's direct supervisor, Gary Arnold, the one who had put her in charge of the task force to begin with, he became a huge obstacle to her work. Now, if you don't remember what Gary Arnold told Jean when she took the position at the head of the task force, I will let her remind you.
Gary Arnold came into my office, stood in front of my desk, looked me straight in the face, and said, "Jean, you are not to use the drug task force to investigate any public official." He turned on his heel and marched out. Now, as startling as that statement might sound, I really didn't think that it was going to pose any kind of problem because at that time, I didn't have any indication that there was any public official in our judicial district who was involved in drugs.
Almost immediately, Jean's undercover team discovered that a number of public officials in her district were indeed involved in drug trafficking. Gary Arnold's directive had now become a dilemma. Jean couldn't include the information in her reports because Arnold would know she was disobeying orders. Also, in case Arnold himself was involved in the corruption, she didn't want him to have access to this information. There was, however, a solution.
I knew at the time that there had been a federal investigation going on for about 9 months into the public official corruption in Saline County, which was being headed by Assistant U.S. Attorney Bob Govar. So Govar seemed to be the likely person to take this information to, which I did, and he was appreciative because it supported the information that he had already been gathering, plus added to and gave him new information to broaden his investigation.
Jean said that just as she and her team started to get into their groove, they were shut down temporarily by Arnold, who claimed at first that he wanted to look into their liability insurance. And Jean Duffy said, quote, But that didn't make sense. Our officers were sworn in as county deputies, as they were in other task forces in the state, and nobody else had problems with insurance. But it kept our guys off the streets. At the end of 2 weeks, Gary Arnold determined the insurance was okay. End quote. So he lets the task force continue operating after 2 weeks of being shut down. But then Duffy's task force was shut down for a second time after she was forced to fire one of her investigators, James Lovett, who she claimed was incompetent to the point of obstruction. Lovett filed an appeal about him being fired, and for 2 months, the task force was shut down while the board considered this appeal. And in this appeal, Lovett claimed he'd been fired because he refused to have sex with Jean Duffy, and obviously she says that was absolutely not true. But basically, Jean Duffy is saying there was no reason for those 2 months while the appeal was being considered to shut us down to begin with. And it seemed that multiple people within and outside of the task force were working against Duffy, and even going so far as to set her up, to make her look bad, to dirty her reputation. In September of 1990, the task force was charged for 35 bank overdrafts, and there were other financial issues as well, including state and federal financial reports being filed late, and the task force agents having issues getting their expenses reimbursed, things like that. So Duffy started to look around, try to figure out why this was happening. She went through the books, and she found out that her financial officer, Kathy Evans, the person she had hired to be in charge of the finances, Kathy had been doing some shady things, including making checks out to cash and forging Duffy's name. Now, Duffy brought this issue to Gary Arnold, who had the state police look into it, and that investigation showed that Kathy Evans had been forging Jean's name on checks, and she had been using the task force funds for her own benefit, including things like, hotel stays. She wrote a check out to cash for like $300. She used several $100s of long-distance phone calls and charged that to the task force, even though they were personal calls. Now, once again, during this investigation into Kathy Evans, the task force was shut down, and Jean Duffy said, quote, "At the time, I couldn't understand why we kept getting shut down for such ridiculous reasons, but now I understand. They didn't want us operating. There was no rationale for our investigators not to be going out while the state police were investigating the books. We weren't accused of mishandling evidence, but that was Gary Arnold's decision. He said, give him a paid vacation while this is going on." End quote. I'm sure the taxpayers appreciate that, Gary Arnold. Now, at this time, someone even reported Jean Duffy to state child welfare officials for suspected abuse of her children. Not only that, but information surfaced showing that one of Jean's daughters, who was 17 at the time, had been given a driver's license, which showed her age as being 21. And this license had been authorized through Duffy's own office by Kathy Evans. And Jean Duffy reported this to the state police. She turned her own daughter in, and Kathy Evans, but nothing was ever done. Now, with all of the public scandal, Jean Duffy was fired as the head of the task force on November 9th, 1990. But in her head, she felt that this was fine because she knew that there was a federal investigation into public corruption or into public official corruption happening under Bob Govar. She'd passed him a ton of great intel and information, and he had told her he was going to carry the torch on and uncover and prosecute these public officials who were up to no good. But that didn't happen either, right? As we know, it didn't happen. It seemed that Jean Duffy had flown too close to the sun, and she didn't have a friend or ally in her corner to pull her back. She'd gotten too close to the truth about a lot of things, including what had happened to Kevin Ives and Don Henry.
In July of 1990, one of Jean Duffy's undercover officers developed evidence linking the train deaths to public officials and drugs. 3 years had passed since the boys had been killed, and Jean had no way of knowing that her drug task force was about to be shut down for nearly solving Kevin and Don's murders.
It didn't occur to me that it was appropriate for our drug task force to reopen the case of the boys on the track until one of my undercover officers came to me and told me that not only was the case drug-related, but it was also solvable. He asked permission to investigate, and I agreed to that and told him that we would take our information then to Bob Govar.
Ironically, Dan Harmon and Richard Garrett, the very same men who had conducted the grand jury investigation of Kevin and Don's murders, were two of the main targets of Govar's drug and corruption investigation. Linda Ives, who for years had believed Harmon and Garrett were sincerely trying to solve her son's murder, now realized they were the ones orchestrating the cover-up.
We certainly don't have any suspects at this point in time. It's been quite a while, and I really didn't anticipate that it would take this long when we first started. I'm frustrated in the amount of time that it's taken. Frustrated that we weren't able to accomplish some things we probably should have been able to. Whatever comes out of it, if someone's charged or not charged, the grand jury has done a tremendous job.
But it still will leave the open question, if the boys were murdered, who did it?
Well, until it's solved, that's correct.
Having Gene Duffy fired wasn't enough. Dan Harmon needed to make sure that in case Gene ever decided to come forward with what she knew about him and his accomplices and this, great drug trafficking operation happening in Saline County, he needed to make sure that if she ever felt like talking about that Duffy's reputation and credibility would be thoroughly destroyed, and nobody would believe her.
To make matters worse, Harmon suddenly became the prosecutor-elect for a 3-county district, which included Saline County. Harmon, who had friends in the Arkansas press, wasted no time in launching a massive media smear campaign against Gene Duffy.
He immediately began a media crusade against me. First of all, using the Benton Courier and Linda Hollenbeck as the reporter, and he also used the Arkansas Democrat and Doug Thompson as the reporter. And for some reason, these two people would write anything that he said to them. They didn't care anything about substantiating anything he said. They just reported it. In the next 5 months, there were over 200 newspaper articles crucifying my reputation. Not one thing that they alleged was truthful. They had me stealing federal funds. They had me making illegal arrests. Every allegation that might destroy my credibility was made. I could have played the same game Harmon was playing and reported to the media the information that I had about him, and truth would have been on my side. But this would have jeopardized the federal investigation. And I wasn't so concerned about public opinion of me because I felt like in the end all the truth was going to come out, because at this point I still had faith in the judicial system.
Harmon was pounding Gene from every angle. He influenced the filing of a $1.2 million lawsuit against Gene. He facilitated the sabotage of task force records through a fiscal officer who was reporting to Harmon. And he was threatening task force informants whose names had been given to him by a task force agent Gene had fired. By September of 1990, Harmon's smear campaign had reached a critical point, and Gene knew that unless Harmon was indicted, her days as head of the task force were numbered. Govar repeatedly assured Gene that indictments against Harmon and others were imminent, but they did not come in time to save Gene's job.
The members of my board of directors had warned me for several weeks that they were not going to be able to continue to support me in the face of all of the bad publicity. And in fact, when they did fire me finally in November, it was not because of anything that I had done wrong, but because I had become, in their opinion, ineffective because of all of the bad press. I had 7 undercover officers working for me. They were family men who needed jobs. 5 of them resigned in protest to my firing.
In January of 1991, Dan Harmon took his newly elected position as state prosecutor, and he called a grand jury to investigate corruption in Saline County as his first order of business, which is rich. It's ironic, because we all know why Dan Harmon likes to convene grand juries. He does it so he can get all the tea on who knows what and who's implicating who and who's connected to who. He does it so he can figure out basically who's a danger to him. And then suddenly those people end up missing or dead. We've kind of already gone over this and Dan Harmon's connections and Dan Harmon's grand jury connections to all of these witnesses who knew about drug trafficking in the Saline County area, who knew about Kevin Ives and Don Henry's deaths. They just were called to talk to the grand jury or called to come in and speak to him or Richard Garrett or the police, and then they would disappear and they would show up dead. Or they would disappear and they'd never show up at all. So then Gene Duffy gets a subpoena to testify at this trial or this hearing. And she was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, I know what he's doing. I know what Dan Harmon's doing. I know he wants to know what I know. He wants to basically put me in a position where I could be in danger, where I could be silenced. So Jean Duffy, she reached out to Bob Govar, and she basically asked him, like, hey, can I get out of this? How can I get out of this? She didn't want to be put under oath, and then asked questions about evidence she'd collected against Dan Harmon and his high-profile buddies. So Govar told Jean to file a motion with Chuck Banks, which was Govar's boss, and this motion would, if Chuck Banks approved it, excuse her from testifying before the county grand jury, as it would conflict with the federal investigation that Bob Govar was handling at that point. Now, Duffy said, quote, Chuck Banks told me to tell Harmon and his grand jury everything I knew, end quote. Yeah, I'm going to pass on that. I would pass on that, Chuck Banks, and Jean Duffy did as well. She just basically didn't show up when she was supposed to testify in front of the jury. She didn't want to. She was afraid. And she also didn't want to give Dan Harmon the entire playbook into this public official corruption investigation. So just a month before this, Chuck Banks had actually removed Bob Govar from the Saline County corruption investigation, and all the indictments that Bob Govar had been planning to bring against Dan Harmon and others, and the indictments that Bob Govar had told Jean Duffy were coming against Harmon and the others, they never did come. They never happened. Enter Charlene Wilson, one of the witnesses that Duffy's task force had been developing, and she had also testified during the federal grand jury about Saline County corruption. Not only that, but Wilson had previously dated Dan Harmon, as well as someone named Roger Clinton, who we need to talk about for a moment. Roger Clinton is the younger half-brother of Bill Clinton, former Arkansas governor and the President of the United States at one point. We remember that. Now, despite their different fathers, Bill and Roger had always been close. Bill sort of acted as like a protector to Roger, because Roger was a mess, all right? He was a hot mess. Roger had a life that was marked with constant substance abuse, constant brushes with the law. He just couldn't seem to get it together, honestly. And in 1984, Roger was arrested as part of a federal investigation into cocaine distribution in Arkansas. He was accused of purchasing and distributing cocaine. The following year, he pleaded guilty to conspiring to distribute cocaine. He only served about a year in prison. It's good to know, people. That's all I gotta say. Now, during Bill's presidential campaign and the following time in the White House, Roger was actually given the code name Headache by the Secret Service because he was just a pain in the ass, right? He was always causing problems for his brother Bill and the administration that they had to kind of like clean up and sweep under the rug, honestly. And in February of 2001, Roger was arrested for driving under the influence in Hermosa Beach, California. He was arrested again for a DUI in California in 2016. But one of the most controversial aspects of Roger Clinton's history was the presidential pardon given to him in 2001 by then-President Bill Clinton. Shortly before leaving office, in the wake of his own scandal, Bill pardoned Roger for his 1985 drug conviction. Now, Roger's troubles, specifically his drug conviction, were frequently cited by critics to attack Bill Clinton's character, especially during Bill's tough-on-crime era in the 1990s, right? Because people are like, hey, you're tough on crime, you're going after, people who are selling drugs, people who are doing drugs, but your own brother you protected. Your own brother, you made sure that this wasn't on his record, so it wouldn't plague him for life. But you have no problem doing that to every other Tom, Dick, and Harry, who's running around living in America, the country that you're the president of, and you're supposed to protect them, and you're supposed to, care about them. But it seems like there's a different set of rules for people in your family than you hold the rest of the American people to. Now, people have linked Roger Clinton's behavior, when I say behavior, I mean his illegal activities, the fact that he never seemed to think that he would ever be held accountable for anything, the fact that he never seemed to want to get better or change or, stop breaking the law and stop being a headache, to his brother, the president. But anyways, people have linked his behavior to broader allegations of corruption or leniency on drug-related issues in Arkansas during Bill's tenure as governor. So let's go back to Charlene Wilson. Remember, dated Dan Harmon, dated Roger Clinton, and in 1993, she was sentenced to 32 years in prison after being charged with possession of a small amount of cocaine. Now, Charlene's son, who was young at the time, he always claimed that he had witnessed sheriff's deputies putting the drugs into his mother's purse during a raid on her home, and the U.S. Supreme Court would eventually overturn Charlene's conviction after they found out that Dan Harmon had retaliated against Wilson due to the testimony she had given against him during the federal grand jury that Bob Govar was heading.
Charlene was recommended to our task force as an informant from DEA, who had used her as an informant, and also from at least 2 other law enforcement agencies that had used her as an informant and said that she was reliable. I used Charlene, and she proved to be very, very reliable. There was not one bit of information that she ever gave me that didn't pan out.
Dan always had cocaine on him, always. Robert Govar and Chuck Banks were the U.S. attorneys for the District of Arkansas at that time. I was subpoenaed to testify on behalf of the drug trafficking and the cartel, more or less is what it was, that had to do with Dan Harmon. I was asked quite in depth about the drug trafficking that went on with Dan Harmon, Mr. Clinton, Roger Clinton.
The very afternoon that Charlene testified before the federal grand jury, that the whole investigation started to unravel. I had taken in 4 informants to be interviewed to testify before the federal grand jury in Saline County affairs. They were actually never interviewed and were in fact badgered and harassed and told to leave.
I received a phone call, and they told me that I had made a very big mistake. And I was assured by the U.S. Attorney's Office that my name, that my testimony, that my statements, that the people that were on that witness list would never, ever be revealed. Well, you know, someone in the U.S. Attorney's Office had given Mr. Harmon a list of the effective witnesses, you know. That don't give you a very good feeling. I'm scared of these people. I'm very scared of them.
Now, listen, I don't want to say that Charlene Wilson was a squeaky clean person. She wasn't. She was a drug user. She sold drugs. She hung out with Dan Harmon and Roger Clinton and the likes of those kinds of people. So it's definitely like she wasn't innocent, you know. But there are allegations that in this moment, the raid was basically planned and premeditated by Dan Harmon. He knew they were going to go in there, and so they had cocaine planted just in case she didn't happen to have any at that point. And so this small amount of cocaine that was found in her purse that she got, 3 decades in prison for, which is absolutely insane. This was planted, that's the allegation, but it's not as if Charlene wasn't a drug user and probably also did have cocaine at the time. So Gene Duffy had brought Charlene Wilson to Bob Govar in December of 1990. Then Charlene testified at Govar's federal grand jury, but then in June of 1991, Chuck Banks shut down Govar's federal grand jury and cleared Harmon as well as the other public officials of any wrongdoing. Now, Scott Llewellyn, who was one of Gene Duffy's investigators in the task force, he was pissed when it got shut down because they were doing a lot of things. They were really finding out a lot of information. And he wanted to continue looking into the leads that he had developed even after the task force was shut down because he was sure that the deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry were connected to what they'd been investigating on the task force. Scott Llewellyn had questioned Betty Alexander, who was the mother of Keith Coney, and remember Keith Coney had died in the motorcycle accident. And Betty told Scott Llewellyn that Eugene, who's another one of her sons, had been in prison, and during one of her visits to Eugene, Betty had met another inmate named Mike Crook, who before he was in prison prison had managed a club called Gigi's. Crook told Betty about a customer who had come into the club who had information about Kevin and Don's deaths. According to this customer, on the night of the boys' deaths, he'd been parked at a dairy barn in Alexander close to the railroad tracks waiting for his wife when he saw 3 teenage boys. One was on a motorcycle, Keith, and they were all smoking weed. Obviously, the other 2 boys besides Keith on his motorcycle would be Don Henry and Kevin Ives. Now, as this man watched, he claimed he saw a police car pull up. The motorcycle boy drove off, then 2 police officers got out, beat up the other 2 boys, threw them in the back of the car, and sped away. When this customer heard the news about Don and Henry the following day, he knew he'd seen something he wasn't meant to, and he talked to, Crook about it, and Crook had advised his customer to tell the Saline County Sheriff's Office what he'd seen. But when this man did tell the sheriff's office what he had seen, he was thrown in jail for 90 days by none other than Sheriff James Steed, allegedly for not paying child support. In Scott Llewellyn's notes, he also talked about an interview he'd had with Charlene Wilson, and she had told him that she dated Dan Harmon back in 1987. She said she and Dan would usually go to a private club in Little Rock, and she said Harmon was always in possession of cocaine, and he would do a line on the way to the club. But then remember, in 1993, Charlene was thrown in prison with this huge sentence for a very small amount of cocaine. In February of 1993, Saline County Deputy John Brown started investigating Kevin and Don's deaths again. Brown had just been hired the year before, and there was a new sheriff in town. Her name was Judy Pridgeon, and she'd promised Linda and Larry Ives that she would assign someone to the case, since the previous 2 sheriffs had dropped that ball time and time again. John Brown was the one who was assigned to the case, and he talked to Linda and Larry in early 1993. He wanted to introduce himself and then reassure them that he was going to do his best. By that summer, Brown actually seemed to have accumulated a lot more information. He told the Ives that he'd found out that low-flying planes had been annoying the residents of Benton, Arkansas, near the train tracks throughout the 80s, and by the early 90s, many police entities in the South had gotten intelligence about drug rings that relied on these planes to get drugs to distribute. Brown had also talked to Charlene Wilson, who at that time was in the Hot Spring County Jail waiting for her trial, while her ex-boyfriend, Dan Harmon, tried to get her locked up for over 3 decades. John Brown told Linda and Larry that he had a signed confession from Charlene that she'd been at the tracks when Don and Kevin were murdered, and she'd been there with Dan Harmon and Keith McCaskill, along with 2 other men. Charlene basically said that the kids, Kevin and Don, were trying to steal the drugs, so they were grabbed and killed. But Charlene Wilson had made several statements to the police, and she'd made some strong statements to the state police 2 weeks before Dan Harmon was cleared of any wrongdoing by Chuck Banks. Charlene said that Dan Harmon kept her high a lot, and she would help him sell and distribute drugs. She talked about a specific drug deal at Le Bistro Club in 1978 or 1979. She claimed that she and Harmon and Roger Clinton had met in the parking lot to exchange an 8-ball. I don't know who was taking the money and who's taking the drugs. I assume that Charlene and Dan had the 8-ball and Roger had the money, but do you think it was was she dating them at the same time? Was it after she had dated Dan and before she dated Roger? Is that how she met Roger? Or was she dating them at the same time and they were all just hanging out together? That was absolutely and perfectly normal. Charlene Wilson said, quote, "I feel that Dan Harmon has more knowledge of the 2 boys' deaths than he has ever told. In late summer, in August, I drove Harmon to Alexander to meet with, I assume, Keith McCaskill to make a pickup. A couple of days later, they have on TV the 2 boys' deaths, supposedly run over by a train," end quote. This is what she's telling the state police 2 weeks before Dan Harmon is cleared of any wrongdoing by Chuck Banks. So Charlene Wilson was asked to talk about, in detail, what had happened on August 22nd, 1987. This is the night that Kevin Ives and Don Henry were murdered. Let's just say it like it is. They didn't die. They were murdered. They weren't just dead. They had been murdered by these grown-ass men. And so she was asked to speak in detail about this. And it's kind of funny because I think this is probably Charlene's daily routine at this time, but she replied, quote, "I got up, did some coke and crystal mixed, called highballing, cleaned up the house, left, and went to find some more. Later on that afternoon, Dan wanted to show me a house, and we went in his car and looked at a house in Alexander. We came back to my house. I ate a sandwich and put on more makeup. Dan asked me to take a ride back out to Alexander with him and asked me to pull down, I think, the old quarry road and wait. I got high while waiting on him to come back, and when he came back, he said, "Let's go." We left and went to my house. He told me to take a shower. I asked him if anything was wrong, and he said no. I took my shower, went and laid down. We made love. He showered and left. I went to sleep. End quote. Yo, why does Dan Harmon get to shower after sex, but he's making Charlene shower before sex? That's a little insulting. It's a little insulting, Dan Harmon. So Charlene would tell multiple stories of this, but there is a belief that the version of events she ended up giving after she'd already been arrested was sort of a forced confession, whereas her saying that she just happened to know that Dan was at the tracks, she didn't actually witness it happening, she was just waiting in the car for him, that's probably closer to the truth. Because remember, she would give a signed confession to this new detective who's looking into things in 1993, and she said, "Oh, I saw this happen, and I saw the people, I saw Keith McCaskill, etc." But in the statement she had given to the state police, she basically just said, yeah, he brought me to this area, the train tracks, where Kevin and Don were murdered, and then had me wait in the car. He gave me enough drugs to keep me busy while I was in there. Then he came back, he said, "Let's go," and we got out of there, which I think is enough, considering everything else that Dan Harmon's, kind of involved with. I think that's enough, placing him at the scene of the crime, knowing that he's an active drug user, he sells drugs, he is kind of making these grand juries and these investigations specifically to find out who knows what, and then those people disappear or die. I think that's enough, but I guess not. I guess not for the good people of Arkansas. So when asked if she was afraid of making these statements to the police, Charlene said yes. She said because Dan Harmon didn't like her.
Guess who arrested her? Dan Harmon. The very guy that she says turned her on to drugs now has her arrested.
Dan Harmon, he walked to me, handed me what was supposed to be a search warrant, and he said, "Bitch," excuse me for saying that, "I told you if you ever brought my name up or brought anything up about the past dealings that we've had, that I'd take you down." He said, "You're going to prison. I'm going to put you in prison." He did. I'm here.
I mean, I've watched second, third offense people walk around with probation on top of probation on top of probation. Not this lady. First time she's been arrested for drugs. They allege that they found in her home. She gets 30 years. Sure, everybody ought to be able to see through this. You have to look at judges. You have to look at prosecutors, local attorneys, and law enforcement officials. Now, these are the people that enforce the drug laws, that prosecute the drug laws, and judge the drug laws. And yet, they are webbed in with the drug trade in the state of Arkansas.
The people at the track that night, to my knowledge, were Dan Harmon. I do know that the boys were watching the drop site, okay? And they got curious as to what was being dropped there.
Now, the man in the pink shirt that you see talking in this clip is Detective John Brown, and he would actually later help Linda Ives during the production of the documentary, Obstruction of Justice, which you're seeing clips from, actually. So in that documentary, two names were given as suspects, Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane. We've already talked about them, right? They were the Pulaski County police officers who it is believed, in the realm of this case, by people who have investigated and looked into it, is believed that they were responsible for basically murdering at least one of the boys by hitting him over the head, and then bringing both boys to Dan Harmon and Keith McCaskill and whoever else they were with, and then the other boy was killed, and then they were placed on the tracks to cover up that this was a murder. So that's going to bring us to a phone call that came to Linda Ives in the summer of 1993. This call was from a man named John Hillier, who said he was a freelance photographer who'd previously worked for NBC, and Hillier said he was in town with his business partner, Pat Matriciana, a filmmaker from California, and together they were working on a film which would expose then-President Bill Clinton. Both men were aware that there was no love lost between Linda Ives and Dr. Fahmy Malek, and this was all a part of their issue with Clinton. Fahmy Malek was a big part of that, how Clinton had protected him, the whole thing going on with Bill Clinton's mother, and Fahmy Malek basically covering for her. This was a big part of their focus. So Linda was like, yeah, you guys can come over, we can talk. They did that. They stayed for several hours, and then they asked Linda to talk about Dr. Malek. They asked her to talk about low-flying planes in the area, and they videotaped her. Now, this film would be distributed under the title The Clinton Chronicles, and it was basically just one long criticism of Bill Clinton, but it also talked about a lending agency called the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, which this documentary film claimed was a front for laundering money made from drugs. The film also ties this in to the Mena airport scandal, right? Mena, Arkansas, and its little airport that Barry Seal was using regularly. And they said that the Mena scandal was, quote, one of the biggest drug smuggling operations in the United States, end quote. And I'm going to read a passage from Mara Levitt's book that she wrote about the boys on the tracks, because she gets everything in this, this one passage that we want to talk about. But Mara Levitt writes, quote, according to the video, ADFA, which was that lending agency, had served as the center of Bill Clinton's political machine, while the drug running at Mina had all occurred under Clinton's approving eye. The gist of the documentary was that during the 1980s, as much as $100 million a month in cocaine had been flown into the airport and Mina, and that much of that money had been laundered through ADFA, a bonding agency Clinton had created to help get small businesses started. Several Clinton associates were portrayed as playing central roles in this scheme. Webb Hubbell, one of Hillary Clinton's law partners at the Rose Law Firm, was also reported to have ties to Mina through a business owned by his father-in-law, a business that, although well-established, had received the first loan arranged by ADFA. Even Clinton's brother Roger was tied in this seedy saga. Much of the video story was told by Larry Nichols, a former ADFA employee who had unsuccessfully sued Clinton after being fired from his post. Nichols claimed that, quote, Bill Clinton not only was part of a system that was laundering millions of cocaine dollars, but he was signing off on it. From its account of the boys' murders, which the narrator explained was believed to have been drug-related, the story widened back to Mina and to reports of how investigations into the drug smuggling there had been repeatedly shut down. After this, Pat Matriciana was interested in making another film, this time focusing on Saline County and the boys on the tracks, and he enlisted people like Gene Duffy and Linda Ives and John Brown, the detective, to help him tell this story, which is what you see in Obstruction of Justice, which is when Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane's names came up as suspects, the two Pulaski County law enforcement officials who had allegedly detained Kevin Ives and Don Henry and even possibly killed Kevin before bringing the boys back to the tracks. To Dan Harmon. Campbell and Lane would file a defamation lawsuit against Matriciana, and just like that, Detective John Brown was suddenly not so cooperative with the filmmakers and Linda Ives anymore. There had been enough witnesses and enough evidence gathered to win this lawsuit. At least that's what everyone involved with obstruction of justice thought. They were like, well, what is this defamation lawsuit? Like, we did our work, we did our research, we made sure that we sourced everything. They're not going to win this, right? But then Lane and Campbell actually did win at trial, mainly because Matriciana's lawyer wasn't allowed by the presiding judge to submit a lot of their evidence that they had collected, but also because several FBI agents testified as character witnesses for these two men, Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane, even though none of these agents had ever worked with Lane or Campbell. And this is, once again, going to bring in the conspiracy theory. It's not just at a local level. It's not just at a state level. You've got the feds involved. You're bringing in FBI agents who don't even know these guys, who are testifying as character witnesses for them in this trial. Well, how can you testify as a character witness for somebody you don't know? So it kind of seems as if maybe the federal government grabbed up, a couple FBI agents and was like, hey, we need you in Arkansas. Go testify at this defamation trial and make sure that, Lane and Campbell win this case. Not only that, but Detective John Brown had changed his tune. He submitted a signed affidavit that he'd warned Matriciana not to implicate the two police officers in the boys' deaths because there was no documented justification for such an implication. His affidavit goes on to say, quote, "I warned him against making such statements in the video and told him that if he made such statements, he would be sued. In fact, prior to the video being produced, I even informed Mr. Matriciana that I had a signed confession from an individual unrelated to Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane, taking responsibility for the deaths of Kevin Ives and Don Henry," end quote. Where's that signed confession, dude? Who signed it? Where is it? Because it's never brought up again. It's never mentioned again. So here is Pat Matriciana's response to John Brown.
Officers Jay Campbell and Kirk Lane filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court against myself and my company. The star witness for their side turned out to be none other than Detective John Brown. While under oath, John Brown perjured himself by claiming he'd warned me not to use Campbell or Lane's names in the video. This was a lie. Brown never said not to use their names, and in fact had insisted to me and my staff that they were indeed the primary suspects in the Ives-Henry murders. Both Linda Ives and Gene Duffy concurred with this conclusion and testified in trial that they believed Campbell and Lane were the hands-on killers and that the government was protecting them. It wasn't until a lawsuit was filed against me by Campbell and Lane that John Brown decided to change his story. Before I even knew I was being sued, Brown had met with Campbell and his attorney and had filed a false affidavit stating he had been edited out of context. However, not one instance of Brown being edited out of context could be found. In fact, John Brown had previously given his approval over the content of the finished video, commended my staff a number of times for their work in the video, promoted the video on scores of radio programs, ordered more than 300 copies of the video, which he sold for profit, and used the video as part of an unsuccessful campaign for sheriff. John Brown had succeeded in doing what Dan Harmon, Chuck Banks, and the FBI had done a decade before. That is, to win the trust of Linda Ives, to take charge of the investigation, and then to systematically destroy it. Much of the evidence supporting our case was barred from the courtroom by the judge, including testimony concerning the disappearance of an eyewitness who could identify Campbell and Lane as the killers. Also barred were state police reports describing intimidation and violence by Campbell and Lane against witnesses in other cases. A number of character witnesses testified on behalf of Campbell and Lane, detailing what great guys, caring people, and trusted officers they were. However, as with Dan Harmon before them, these witnesses turned out to be wrong. Following my trial, Campbell was fired by the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department for intimidating and blacklisting fellow officers and for falsifying reports. One of the character witnesses who testified on behalf of Campbell, that is FBI agent Mike Smith, was not allowed to be impeached or cross-examined by our attorney regarding his bias, prejudice, and conflict of interest. Ultimately, the jury was made to feel that they had no choice but to find in favor of the plaintiffs and against us. The judge cited John Brown's testimony as the key factor in upholding the jury's decision.
And so the plot thickens. In December of 1993, the FBI began their own investigation into Kevin and Don's deaths. One of the things the federal agents first tried to do was to get a witness, a young witness, into protective custody because he had come forward that same month and he had spoken to a friend of Kevin's about how he had actually witnessed what had happened to Kevin and Don. So this witness was Tommy Niehaus. He would have been just about 11 when Kevin and Don were killed. And he ended up talking to Linda Ives. And he also put Dan Harmon on the railroad tracks the night of Kevin and Don's murders. And Linda Ives, in the documentary Obstruction of Justice, she's like, at first I kind of thought he was full of it. Like, he was so young at the time. Like, how would he even know who Dan Harmon was? Well, it turns out that Tommy Niehaus knew who Dan Harmon was because Dan Harmon was sleeping with his mother, right? So here's Tommy Niehaus talking about what he saw that night to Detective John Brown.
We didn't realize there was anybody else out there at first. We were just, like I said, goofing off. And we come up on, or didn't really come up on, we noticed there were people on the track. So a flashlight come on and then go back off. They weren't looking in our direction, but we could see the light. And so we kind of quieted down and snuck up a little bit closer to see what was going on. And there was 5 individuals standing on the tracks. One thing that struck my curiosity is at the time my mother was dating an attorney named Dan Harmon. I knew him well enough to recognize him. There were 2 more individuals that a few minutes after we got there were walking down the railroad tracks that had a rifle and what looked to be a flashlight. And they were more or less kind of minding their own business. And when they realized someone else was on the tracks, they stopped and was fixing to turn around when someone, or Danny, motioned for them to come closer over to where they were. They hesitated and eventually ended up walking on towards the rest of the group. While my head was turned, I heard what sounded like a gunshot. I saw a flash, as you would expect with a gunshot at night. We were pretty much terrified and bolted and ran.
Dan Harmon gets around, dude. He's married, like several times. He's dating Charlene Wilson. He's dating Tommy's mom. He's running drugs and grand jury cases. If he wasn't such a piece of shit, I'd be impressed because he can multitask like no other. Or was he just a psychopath who knew how to lie as easily as he breathed, who knew how to wear the right mask in front of the right people, feeling zero empathy about anyone he was misleading, betraying, and hurting? Dan Harmon was a real stand-up guy, a true gentleman, the kind of guy you want to bring home to your mom. He's, for all the illegal activities that he gets into, also, dude's always broke, right? He's always broke. He always, they said he always looked like kind of scattered and kind of like messy, like his shirt was always untucked. He's running around with all these different women, making them shower before sex. Like, I digress. According to the FBI, Tommy's story actually matched information they'd already gathered in relation to this case. And the special agent who was placed in charge of this new FBI investigation into Kevin Ives and Don Henry's death, her name was Special Agent Phyllis Kernan, and she immediately requested the files from the federal Saline County investigation into public official corruption. Now, by this time, Linda Ives was thoroughly suspicious of Dan Harmon, and stuff was coming out about him, and he was acting kind of crazy. Like, he had gone into, I think, Chuck Banks' office and started like screaming at him. And then all of a sudden, Chuck Banks is like, Dan Harmon didn't do anything wrong. And Linda kind of was there and witnessed some of this erratic and bizarre behavior. She no longer trusted him. I'll make a long story short. And so she started creating distance between herself and Dan Harmon since the grand jury that he had been heading had wrapped up. Now, Phyllis Kernan also wanted to have Kevin and Don's clothes tested again, this time by the FBI crime lab, which she arranged. Linda Ives kept in contact with Kernan on a regular basis, and she was assured that if they just stepped aside, stepped back, allowed the wheels of justice to turn, the FBI would have the case solved by the end of the year. That didn't happen, right? That didn't happen, as we know. And at the end of the day, the FBI's investigation, which they claim was extensive, was also inconclusive and failed to lead to any criminal charges. So I could tell you, like, oh, they got the clothes tested and they interviewed this person. In my opinion, it was all for show. There would be absolutely no point in telling you that because it was all for show. And I'd be wasting your time and mine, because this seems to be a pattern in this case. Prosecutors' hearings, grand juries, investigation after investigation, all this evidence looked at, but no connections made, no arrests made, no one brought to task for their involvement in the deaths of 2 teenage boys who it looks like were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because you'll never convince me that Kevin and Don were trying to steal Dan Harmon's drugs. I think they were just out there being teenage boys, maybe looking for some weed, and doing some spotlight hunting. And they encountered Dan Harmon and his cronies on the tracks waiting for that drop. So many people, including the family members of Kevin and Don, have alleged that the FBI's investigation was obstructed or intentionally stymied, either by political pressure or by individuals in law enforcement. Theories suggest that the FBI may have faced pressure from federal and or state officials to limit the scope of their investigation. So for instance, Linda Ives would be like, oh, look into this person, this is like drug-related, look into Keith McCaskill, stuff like that. And Phyllis Kernan, the FBI agent, would be like, no, we're focused on, Don and Kevin. And it's like, yeah, of course you're focused on Don and Kevin. However, if these other things outside of these two kids have something to do with what happened to Don and Kevin, you'd want to investigate. But they didn't. The feds have been heavily criticized for failing to pursue leads aggressively during their sham of an investigation, which has obviously contributed to the perception of a cover-up and a conspiracy. And honestly, it's not hard to believe that a cover-up and a conspiracy happened here.
Right straight to the state capitol.
At the Arkansas state capitol, Governor Clinton shared an adjoining office with state drug czar Robert Shepard. Shepard, a former sheriff from Dan Harmon's district, was appointed by Clinton to lead Arkansas's so-called war on drugs. On at least 3 occasions, Shepard attempted to suppress investigations into Kevin and Don's murders. In 1990, Shepard paid a visit to U.S. Attorney Chuck Banks to persuade him that Gene Duffy should be ignored. In 1993, Shepard told John Brown that his career would be better off if he concentrated his efforts elsewhere. And in 1995, FBI agent Phyllis Cornyn reported that Shepard had attempted to interfere with the case. Eyewitnesses had implicated several people in the murders and subsequent cover-up, including prosecutor Dan Harmon, Deputy Prosecutor Richard Garrett, Sheriff Jim Steed, and officers Jay Campbell, Kirk Lane, and Danny Allen. Throughout his career, Dan Harmon has been protected by the powerful and corrupt in Arkansas. In 1990, he was arrested on 4 misdemeanor counts of tax evasion. At his arraignment, he was ordered to take a routine drug test which would have allowed him to go free. He refused and spent 18 days in jail. Harmon was later convicted of one of the charges and was sentenced by the notorious U.S. District Judge Henry Woods to 1-year probation, the absolute minimum allowed. As a result of his conviction, Harmon's law license was suspended. The suspension, however, was rescinded after a long list of high-ranking Arkansas officials, including Attorney General Winston Bryant, testified on Harmon's behalf. For many years, Bryant had been involved in the Mina drug smuggling investigations. More recently, at least 15 domestic violence complaints filed against Harmon by a number of his ex-wives have surfaced. The complaints, some of which Harmon has admitted to, range from holding a gun to his wife's head to biting off the thumb of one of his victims. Charges were never filed, and the reports were kept from the public by Harmon's friend, Benton Police Chief Rick Elmendorf. Dan Harmon continued to receive extremely favorable treatment from the Arkansas press. His continued re-election as Saline County prosecutor also gave him control over the drug task force, Gene Duffy's old job. In November 1995, a package containing fake cocaine labeled as evidence belonging to Harmon's drug task force was found in the possession of Harmon's wife, Holly. An investigation revealed the package had originally contained more than $100,000 worth of pure cocaine, which was now missing. A combined raid by the FBI and DEA confiscated drug-related files from Harmon's home and office. A racketeering case against Harmon was reportedly being built. However, after years of seeing similar investigations go nowhere, a weary public remains understandably skeptical. Finally, on November 29, 1995, the FBI, referring to Kevin and Don's murders, announced to Linda Ives that in light of the fact there is no evidence, it's time you consider the fact that a crime has not been committed. The obstruction of justice continues.
So at this point in the series, we are beating a dead horse, which is an expression I hate, but it fits. As you know, today, this case is technically unsolved, but all the shady people involved in it eventually showed their asses, meaning they showed exactly who they were. After years of allegations, Dan Harmon's criminal behavior caught up with him. In 1996, Harmon was arrested on multiple charges, including drug trafficking, racketeering, extortion, and witness tampering. Harmon was convicted in 1997 on 5 federal counts, including conspiracy to distribute drugs. Prosecutors presented evidence that Harmon had been using his position as a prosecuting attorney to facilitate and protect drug trafficking operations in Saline County. And as a result, Harmon was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for his crimes. Remember, Charlene Wilson for possessing some cocaine, 33 years. So this conviction effectively ended his career as a public official, and it marked him as one of the most infamous figures in Arkansas corruption scandals. After serving his time, Harmon was released from prison in 2006. However, he continued to encounter legal troubles. In 2010, he was arrested again, this time for a failure to pay court-ordered restitution related to his previous crimes. It seems that there was and is so much evidence that should have left at least a handful of these people being brought to justice for what happened to Kevin Ives and Don Henry. Like, including Dan Harmon, including Sheriff James Steed. Honestly, Richard Garrett, too, in my opinion. So why did that never happen? Now, obviously, there was some sort of conspiracy here, and we will never know how deep it went or all the individuals who were involved. The Boys on the Tracks case is a sobering reminder of how those in power can manipulate systems, hide the truth, and evade justice to protect their interests. When corruption and self-preservation take precedence over accountability, those with influence and authority become untouchable, weaving conspiracies that silence the vulnerable and bury inconvenient truths. The lack of resolution in this case, and so many others like it, exposes a troubling reality. Power often shields itself from consequences, leaving the public to wrestle with unanswered questions and fractured trust. In the end, the pursuit of justice remains a fight against a system designed to protect itself. A stark warning that vigilance and transparency are our only safeguards against the unchecked ambition of those in power. And while we will remain vigilant, we clearly can't expect much transparency from those in power, because we've never really gotten it at all, have we? So that's where we ended up with the Boys on the Tracks case. I do think that they were grabbed because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, because they saw Dan Harmon. Dan Harmon could not have that. He couldn't have anybody being able to identify him in the presence of known criminals in the middle of doing a criminal activity. And, maybe he thought that they were trying to steal the drugs. Maybe he was all hopped up on cocaine, as he always was, that he was paranoid and kind of reacting rashly. But either way, I do believe that Kevin and Don were killed because they witnessed a drug drop from a low-flying plane. I believe that many, many of the high-ranking authorities in Saline County knew exactly what was happening. Not only that, but they facilitated it. They didn't just look the other way, they helped. And they were a lot of them were just all in on it together. And those who weren't, they weren't. And they were kind of left out. But still, everybody sort of knew what was happening. And Kevin and Don were collateral damage. Their families never, ever got any closure. They never got any answers. And that's where we are. I'm sorry it's not the best ending to this story, but if you want more information, you can read Mara Levitt's book. I'll link it in the description box. It's a great read. You can also watch Obstruction of Justice, the documentary that Linda Ives helped kind of create. I will link that in the description box. There's also a specific web page and a specific YouTube channel that I'm going to link, and you can find a lot of information on there about this case, so I'll kind of let you meander around. If we were to talk about everything that happened, this would go on and on and on. It would be longer than the Bonnie and Clyde series, so check for those links in the description box. Hit like if you liked the video, subscribe if you haven't already, share it if you think it's worth sharing, and I will see you very soon. But until next time, stay kind, stay beautiful, and stay safe. Bye.
Well, the levee don't break now, and the bottle's going straight down.